Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Mondays with Mike. Today we're talking about fog. What's the deal with fog? I mean, why is it a cloud on the ground? Why isn't it up in the air? That's what we're talking about today. All about fog, the different kinds of fog, and why we here in the Galveston, Houston area should see plenty of it over the next several days, or at least a really good chance for some patchy areas of fog over the next several days. Other than that, hope you enjoyed a nice sunny weekend. It was pretty beautiful around here. The mornings were kind of brisk. You know, the humidity was still low, lots of sunshine Saturday and Sunday, so it turned out to be pretty nice. I kind of wish I would have got out in it a little bit more personally, but, I was being a little bit lazy. The groundhog saw his shadow yesterday. Now, there are actually a lot of different animals across the country. They have like a crawfish, I think, in New Orleans or something, and whatever. They also have another competing groundhog that is in New York somewhere that we talked about this morning. I think his name was Chuck. But anyway, the most famous of them all, Punxsutawney Phil, they say that he saw a shadow and there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. And they actually do have some pretty kind of ugly weather, some snow, and maybe even some ice headed their way up there in Pennsylvania. But around here, we are looking completely opposite. It's going to feel like springtime around here over the next several days, the rest of this week. And that brings me to fog. So let's talk about it. We want to begin with the outlook for this week and the setup for sea fog. Now, the temperatures off the coastline, let me go ahead and give you a proper current temperature, because I was looking at this over the weekend, and the water temperatures out there off the coastline are pretty chilly. Let me get a marine observation for you. So the Galveston buoy right now is reporting a water temperature of 55 degrees. So actually all the buoys here along our coastline are about 57, 62, 60. So all very, very cold. I mean, you would not want to go swimming in that, trust me. But that's where they're at right now. And so given the fact that we're going to get close to 80 degrees today, and Galveston, you guys should get close to about 72, maybe 73 for today and for the next several days, there's a big contrast between the water temperature, the surface water temperature, and the air temperature. And so when you have that contrast, especially when the air is very moist, I know people don't like that word, but very humid, well, that contrast is either going to create condensation or, in this case, fog, which is simply a cloud with its base on the ground. Technically, it's a dense cloud, with its base on the ground. So in this case, it gives us low visibilities initially out in the water, and then it pushes inland. So this moist and relatively warm air moves over the water. That's about 60 degrees. Like I said, 57 to 62 degrees. And so that causes the air to saturate. So with that in mind, it either can condense onto different surfaces, or in this case, it kind of stays as a 100% humidity, or sometimes even higher than 100% humidity, and it finds little things to settle on. These are called cloud condensation nuclei. And in the case of sea fog, it's probably mostly tiny pieces of salt, actually. And so technically the fog, if you were to taste it, would be just a hint salty. There also can be things like dust particles and light smoke and different things that would produce haze, but that's what it attaches onto. So the air cools, it reaches its saturation level, which forms fog right there on the surface, which is dangerous to like shipping and fishing and things like that. So when there is dense fog, a lot of times the shipping will be paused in and out of Galveston Bay and the ship channel, and so you'll see, like if you were to look at a display of tracking vessels, which a lot of, I look at that stuff all the time. You can Google it if you want, but you'll see all of them lined up out there in the Gulf of Mexico because they're anchored until they can come in to port. because it's just unsafe to do that. So the fog forms here along the surface, and then it gets blown inland. So this is a combination of sea fog, but also what we would call advection fog. Advection is when the air moves sideways. Convection is when it moves up and down. So here's a look at the setup for something that you've seen a lot of times on cold mornings. Okay, this is when we get really, really cold, and you see what looks to be steam rising off of the top of a lake or a river, or sometimes it's even a swimming pool. You know, you'll drive by a canal kind of thing, and you'll see this steam rising off of it. Well, this is sort of the opposite setup. So in the case of sea fog, you have cold water, warm air, which causes the contrast. In this case, it's sort of reversed. You have warmer water, colder air. When this happens, by the way, over the ocean or over the Gulf or a body of water like that, a lot of times it's referred to as sea smoke. And that's an old-fashioned term. It is not smoke, but it looks like it's smoke. And so to the old-fashioned mariners, you know, in the days of yore, they would call it sea smoke. So the setup here is just, for example, you would have a water temperature of 58 degrees. And for example, you'd have an air temperature of 49 degrees. And so that cold air mass, the air mass is saturated when it comes into contact with that warm surface of the water. And in fact, the evaporating warm water comes off of it and condenses again onto those small pieces of dust in the atmosphere, or whatever is there for it to condense onto, which again is called a condensation nucleus. And as that kind of bubbles up, it creates these clouds. Now, typically they don't stay there. You know, you'll notice that it kind of wafts up and then dissipates, right? So in this case, it forms that little layer right over the surface of the warm water, but then as it continues to rise, the air is no longer saturated, and so that's why you don't see, you know, fog lingering there very often. If the conditions are just right, if there is very little, if any, wind, then it can persist on the surface of things like lakes and so forth. So again, that's sort of the opposite of the sea fog type of setup. Now, this is the variety of fog that we actually see most often around here. It's the most common type of fog in a place like we live, and it's called radiation fog. Now, the radiation does not mean that it's fog that's formed by a nuclear power plant. Different kind of radiation. In this case, we're talking about the Earth radiating infrared rays. That's how the Earth, one of the ways that the Earth it cools, is that you have radiation that comes in from the sun that we can see. It's called visible light, and that's called shortwave radiation. And the shortwave radiation heats up the ground during the day, and then at night, particularly on clear nights, the Earth emits infrared. Well, it's always going to emit it, whether it's cloudy or not. The infrared radiation is going to come off of the Earth, but it's allowed to actually escape back into space on nights that are not cloudy. So this is the ideal setup for fog, is when you have, let's say the ground is wet from a couple of days of rain, and then all of a sudden colder air moves in, or at least a clear sky builds in. It gets a little cooler, and if the wind is light enough, then you'll have this setting up where you have very moist air near the ground. You have drier air way up in the atmosphere so that it prevents any clouds from forming. And this thin layer of moisture near the surface forms a layer of fog. And this can be persistent for many, many hours. A lot of times this will just sit there for 8 hours, maybe up to 10 hours, especially when there is a temperature inversion that takes place, which is what we have demonstrated here, which is warmer air over cooler air. We call that a temperature inversion. And in that case, the fog doesn't really have anywhere to go. And you need one of two things in order to break up this kind of fog. You either need a breeze to kick in, or you need the temperature to warm up. So if you have neither of those, then the fog can persist for a long time. So that is called radiation fog, or radiational fog. And it's something that we see here in the Houston area very commonly. It's really probably the easiest to form type of fog, and we see it, like I said, pretty often. So the moisture rises, it turns into, it is vapor, and then it forms into liquid water, which is what we see in the form of those tiny droplets. Now, we do not have mountains here in the Houston area. as you know, except for maybe like a landfill or something. But other parts of the country obviously do, the Rocky Mountains and also like the Appalachian Mountains and all the mountains like the Adirondacks and the Poconos and the Smoky Mountains. I mean, that's one of the reasons they're called the Smoky Mountains, is because of this type of fog which happens in mountainous areas. So in this case, you have this cold air that's right on the surface of maybe some of the lower elevations. And that air gets pushed up. And when it goes upward, it cools. And it cools due to the fact that the air gets lower. And when you move air upwards, it, what's an easiest way? It's called adiabatic. But basically, when you push air down, it heats up. When you move it up, it cools off, typically. And when that gets pushed up the side of the mountain, it cools, and you get this moist layer that forms there. You get saturated air. This is why we get thunderstorms, for example. You know, in the summertime, the moist air rises, and it cools down, and it condenses, and then it becomes 100%, it hits 100% humidity, and you get the formation of clouds above the ground. In this case, the clouds are forming at the surface right there on the mountain. And so that turns into sort of that hazy kind of vapor that you see as the air turns from a gas into a liquid. Sometimes it rains, or sometimes it turns foggy when it rains, and we have reduced visibility. Now, you will see this from time to time here in the Houston area. That's where you have warm air that moves in, and obviously rainy air is going to be humid. I mean, we can figure that, right? The raindrops become warmer as they move through this warmer layer that's above the ground, and as they do, they actually evaporate into the cooler air, or into the air near the bottom, and cool it off. And I think we all know this. It cools off when it's raining, right? We experience this all the time, is that if there's a difference between the temperature and what's called the wet bulb temperature, which is kind of similar to a dew point, and the water evaporates into that, it cools that air down. And so we experience that all the time, that the air cools down. Well, if conditions are just right, then you'll get that moist layer near the surface that will become saturated. And again, if the winds are just right and everything, then you could get fog forming after rain, or even sometimes during rain. You may have even seen something similar where during a really, really hot afternoon, the roads are really hot, and then when the cooler rain hits that, you'll get the formation of some really shallow fog right there on the street as well. So that's kind of cool to see, and it's pretty common. All right, so this next type of fog that we're going to talk about is an advection fog. So as I mentioned before, sea fog, which was the first slide that we looked at, which is what's going to form here around Galveston for the next few days, can form and then blow inland, which starts out as sea fog and then turns into an advection fog. We also just have plain advection. Remember, convection is when the air goes up and down. So the hot air rises, the cool air falls. The hot air rises, the cool air falls. That's called convection. And it's associated with thunderstorms. You also have like a convection oven you can cook things in, which is moving the air around instead of the air just sitting there. In the case of advection, that's moving air from one spot to another. So you can have cold air advection that brings in colder air. Let's say behind a cold front, you get cold air advection. And the opposite, behind a warm front, you might get warm air advection. So in this case, you have a breeze that's bringing in fog from one place and moving it to another place. So you have the wind that's blowing, you have, let's say, cool conditions at the surface, which cause the air to cool down and become saturated. And so then you have fog that forms there near the surface, and then the fact that there's wind blowing pushes the fog to another place. And so we call that advection fog. And that's sort of what's tied in with the fog that we had today. What areas most commonly get fog? Well, let's take a look at this. It's a really interesting graphic here that shows us the areas that have the most, the days of the most dense fog. It's really, really neat to see. So we'll notice that a few areas here show up, and they all sort of have a few things in common. So let me see if I can draw on this. It'd be really nice if I could draw on it. I think I can. So here we go. So you have this area here, which kind of includes Houston. And so, what do you have here? You have the Gulf of Mexico, and you have all this humidity. You're going to have warm, humid air. You're also, during the wintertime, you're going to have a contrast of cold water, warm air. You could also sometimes have let's say in the early part of the fall, or maybe in the late spring, you might have cold air over warm water. So either way, that's one of the areas that's prone to getting fog, because you get sufficiently cold enough to cause that contrast between the cold air and the warmer water. Now notice it doesn't happen over here in Florida that often. So, South Florida is a very humid place, but fog is much more rare because it's warm all the time. There's just not really that much of a reason for fog to form. Now over here, you may be wondering, like, well, okay, well, why is there like just randomly some fog here? Well, because that is mountains. So this here is right the heart of Appalachia, right, or Appalachia. So these are mountains that run here from southern Ohio through West Virginia, through Kentucky, western parts of North Carolina, mountains of Tennessee, the mountains of South Carolina, and even here in North Georgia. So all these areas are the Appalachian Mountains, and the Appalachian are rolling hills, and you have hills and valleys, and so you have a lot of opportunity for fog to form, like radiational fog to form in the valleys. Then you also have some of that mountain fog that forms that I shared with you before. So that is a very foggy area. Up here in parts of northern New England, you have a combination. You have a combination of mountains, but then you also have this cold and saturated marine air that comes in. So, you get that just, it's so cold. It's like the water temperature's in the 40s, and it blows in and interacts with the mountains, and you can get several different types of fog there. And elsewhere, let's see. So, it's sort of like hit and miss sort of fog across other parts of the country. Obviously, you do not have very much fog here because this is the desert. So can there be fog? Of course there can be fog, but it's not very common because the air is super dry. Over here on the west coast of the United States, you actually do have a lot of fog, like places like San Diego and Los Angeles will have a lot of fog. Hold on, I gotta add some place names here because it just makes it so much easier, doesn't it? Watch this. Here we go. So places like Los Angeles and San Diego and up the coastline here, you'll actually have a lot of fog in this area because you have cold water out here. I mean, the Pacific Ocean is has a cold weather current here that flows down like this. That's an ugly arrow, but that flows down like this. So that's why, look, I've never been in the Pacific Ocean, but I assume that maybe some of you out there have been, and you'll see surfers and stuff, they wear like wetsuits, where you don't necessarily see them wearing that in Florida or something, and it's because the water out there is cold. So you have marine fog that forms out here, and it actually does advect in, and it'll come in like this when you have a reversal of the winds. So over here in California, you have an offshore flow. Okay, so we just went through this with the fires, right? You have an offshore wind flow that is warm and dry, and then that will reverse, and you get what's called the marine layer coming in, and it's colder and can get very foggy. So that's similar to what we can experience here over the next couple of days, where we're getting that sea fog that's advecting in. And then for the same reason, you can imagine up here, Oregon and Washington State, it's humid, it's misty, it's cold, and so it's just kind of yucky. overall. So we are one of the places that actually sees some of the most fog across the country. Here's a time lapse that I ran. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but the reason I wanted to show you is that you can see how low the cloud cover is here. So the Williams Tower there is about, what, 800 feet tall? Let me look this up. Williams Tower. I mean, I'm going to guess it's 800 feet, something like that. Let's see how close I am. 64 stories, and it has a height. It's the 4th tallest building in Texas, and it has a height of 900. Did I say 900? Did I say it? Okay. It has a height of 902 feet. I think I was pretty close. Did I say 800? I might have said 800. Anyway, so the height, the top of it is 900 feet, but then so all these clouds are way below it. So these clouds are basically on the ground, between around 20 or 30 feet above the ground and maybe only up to around 400 or 500 feet. So that's that fog that's advecting in from the south. So started as sea fog and then moved its way up. So back on camera here. That's sort of the deal for this week that we're going to be dealing with, sort of some fog. Also, some warmer air. So, for example, today, as of the time that you may be watching this, if you're watching it live, it is Monday, February 3rd, and the record high today is actually 80 degrees. And that's breakable. It's a very breakable high temperature, meaning it's within reach of being broken today. Yesterday, we had, let's see, the high temperature yesterday reached 79. The record was 83. And then the record today is 80. That was set back in 2008. That's the official Houston record. The record for Hobby Airport specifically is 81. That was set back in 1957. Galveston, I don't think will hit their record today. The record is 75. That was set in 1954. And then let me just pull up the records for the rest of this week, because let's see if any of these other high temperatures are breakable. So let's see. We're looking at, this is February the 3rd, and today's record high, again, is 80. Tomorrow's record high for Tuesday is 81. Wednesday is 83. Thursday is 82. And then the record for Friday is 86. Now, when I show you the 7-day here, you'll see that we're going to be within a few degrees, actually, of each one of those high temperatures. So we could be looking potentially at some high temperatures this week. Each day it's going to be like 79, 80, 81. So like I mentioned, the record high temperatures are between 80 and 83. So we'll get close to that for this week. So I want to thank you for joining me here on Mondays with Mike. I want to give a shout out to my mom and Neil in Florida. We got a lot going on, a lot to talk about in the days to come. Super Bowl weekend on Fox 26. We have the game. Of course, the game is being played in New Orleans. We've got it covered from head to toe. It's probably going to be 24 hours of football here on Fox 26. So anyway, that should be a lot of fun. I'm pulling for the Eagles, not because I have anything against the Chiefs. I mean, I love Patrick Mahomes. It's just I'd really like to see Jalen Hurts, local guy, Channelview High School, just a dedicated athlete. We met his father. Well, I didn't meet his father. We had his father on the air last week, and it just seems to be a really, really terrific guy. Coached him, just a really, good dude. So I'm rooting for Jalen Hurts. So we'll see. And Saquon Barkley, too, because I think he deserves to get himself a championship, too. So anyway, thanks so much for joining me here. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you learned something about fog, probably more than you ever thought somebody would drone on about fog. So hopefully now you know what the deal is with all of this fog. See you later, guys.